Nathan is the president of ANRC, and he'll explain what that name means, I'm sure. He's also going to tell you a little bit about his background, which is rather interesting as well. And he is a local company. He does have some satellite offices, et cetera, but he'd like to do more local business. And I think he has some really interesting things to say to you today. Nathan?
Thank you, Dave. So, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I think we can do better than that. We're at a college campus. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Ah, much better. Thank you. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm actually truly honored to be here, and I'll tell you why I'm truly honored to be here in a few minutes. But it's great that the North Texas ISSA is putting stuff like this on, and it's great that Collin College is so graciously hosting us here and being a part of it as well. So thank you to them first and foremost. I'm here to talk to you about assuming network compromise and what that does in your mind, at least, on your network security posture, right? Assuming network compromise and how it can lead to a more proactive threat detection or threat defense. Now, before I get started, I just want a quick show of hands. How many students are out there in the audience? Okay. How many information security professionals in the field are out there? Phew, I'm in the right place, I'm telling you. I've been on a plane more in the last 3 weeks than I think I have my entire life. And I have to ask those questions at the beginning of my briefing because otherwise I might give a cybersecurity talk to people that's wanting dancing lessons, and I don't dance very well. So, enough bad jokes, we'll get started. So ANRC, what does it stand for? I get that all the time. And honestly, it doesn't stand for anything anymore. It was supposed to stand for Automated Network Reconnaissance Corporation. And when we started the company in 2007 in San Antonio, Texas, that's what we were going to do. We were going to do automated pen testing. Turns out that we weren't as good at pen testing, and there wasn't as much of a market for it at the time as there is now. And we were actually better at doing training anyway. So the stars aligned and we got where we needed to be. Now, ANRC is a training, consulting, and solutions provider, but all we do is focus on cybersecurity. And that true focus and the way that we do our training is 70% hands-on, 30% lecture. And that got started down at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. So the initiative came from them. The response was loud and clear that they enjoyed that kind of training. And that led to 2 government contracts up in Washington, D.C., where now you can see we're about 25 to 30% of the DoD's cyber protection team pipeline training for the DoD. And so all the armed forces, the Air Force, Marines, Navy, even the Coast Guard come to these classes. We have DoD civilians and contractors as well, all grouped in under the U.S. Cyber Command. So proud of that, and we want to continue to do good at that. We also do threat assessment services. We're doing some locally now here in Dallas, which I'm proud to say as well. So we do services and consulting to go in and test people's systems and security postures. And we have some proactive network defense products, which I'll show you later, but I don't want this to be a marketing event, right? I'm here to educate. I'm here to have dialogue with you guys. So we want to get through these slides and have those discussions that are really what this is all about. All right? So when I started the company, I said, you know, if you don't stay up with the cutting edge in cybersecurity, you become obsolete in a minute, matter of hours, days, even in certain cases. So we automatically just built in a research group to our company. And that has led us to things like DEF CON. We were able to talk at DEF CON, Black Hat, things like that. DEF CON 21, a couple years ago, we released a tool that was free to the public to help reverse engineers go through Mach-O binaries on the Mac platform. So whether it's an iPhone or a MacBook or whatever, there just wasn't a whole lot of reverse engineering tools for this. And you might say, well, that's because Mac doesn't get malware, right? Well, a lot of people would disagree. So there is actually malware that is able to run on Mac. It's not as much as Windows, obviously, but there wasn't enough good tools out there for that. So we released a tool that you could actually use through the browser to reverse engineer binaries that run on Mac operating systems and try to identify malicious code. So enough about ANRC, and I won't go too far into me, you can read my bio there. I've got 15 years of experience, and I've worked at the DoD. I was a lab manager for malware analysis down in San Antonio. So that kind of got my feet wet. But the reason why I was honored to be here is because I wouldn't be here without my education. I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for my master's degree program at the University of Tulsa. And don't hold it against me that I'm from Oklahoma. But the program was excellent. And honestly, back then, I was in the second graduating class of what they called the Cyber Corps. And the Cyber Corps was a NSF scholarship foundation that was basically funded by the DoD and the NSF, where they paid for your school if you would go through school and then return the equivalent amount of time that it takes you to get your degree at a government agency. Right? They shouldn't have let me in, to be honest with you. I had a friend that was in the first graduating class that vouched for me and said to the dean, I think you should give this guy a chance. He's really hardworking, and you know, maybe not the best test taker, but he's smart, and he'll do a good job. When I took the GRE for the acceptance into that program and proudly took my mediocre scores to the dean, he almost fell out of his chair. I mean, he literally was like, you know, to put it the nicest way possible, he said, I think you might have a learning disability. And that's not the words he used, but I won't repeat what he said. And then he also said, you probably won't make it through the first semester, but you know, Rick says you're good, I'll give you a chance. I'm glad he did, because I got my degree 3 semesters later, 18-hour semesters, really tough, right? Most graduate students get the luxury of 9 credit hours per semester. I was doing 15 to 18, and I ate, slept, and breathed that campus in that dorm room and in my graduate office. I'm proud to say that I walked down the aisle on graduation day and I shook that same dean's hand with white ropes on, because I had one of the highest GPAs in the program. And it was a huge accomplishment to me. I'm not being egotistical here. I'm saying if those 2 people hadn't given me a chance, and if I hadn't really applied myself and believed in myself the whole way, instead of listening to his, you know, his discouraging remark that I probably flesh out in the first semester, I wouldn't be here. Right? I wouldn't have gotten the government job that I did that exposed me to some of these things, and I wouldn't have the reputation and all the way through my business. Right? So while we're at a college, I feel like I should at least give homage to the education process. Right? All right, so let's get into some of the actual content here. So our agenda today, we're going to be talking about you know, how to analyze your security posture and become more proactive. We'll start off with some cyber threats, lay of the land. I like to do this. Every time I give this talk, I have to update slides because things are changing constantly. And then we'll talk about the differences between reactive and proactive network defense and how you would implement a more proactive defense. I'll show you some R&D that we've done to kind of implement some of these topics and techniques, and then we'll have a session for question and answer. All right, so lay of the land. Right, so these are some recent stuff. I mean, we're almost into May now, so maybe not that recent, but February. These were the major breaches of February, at least according to this company. So we had a total of 7, you know, at least major breaches. And you can see there that they estimate about 79 million people were affected, right? $15 billion in revenue may have been lost. Now, obviously, those are estimated, so that's not just millions of dollars like credit card fraud and identity theft. That's also the reputational value of the company, right? The stock prices that went down as a result of those things. And 79 million, that's a lot, but 78.8 million of it came from one company, and that was Anthem, right? So you guys probably heard about Anthem being hacked, right? That was the big one there. If we look at March, number of breaches went up, values went down, so I guess that's good and bad, right? So nine total breaches, and we had Perimeter was one of the bigger ones, Perimeter Blue Cross up in Washington, I believe, or Oregon, I can't remember. And Advantage Dental was another big one that you might have heard about. Overseas, you don't hear as much, but they have just as many breaches over there as well. Notice Hilton Hotels had an insider attack. So the ugliest of the ugly, yeah, there's no good, the bad, the ugly when you're talking about data breaches, right? So the ugliest one, obviously, with the biggest one so far has been Anthem, right? And I did some math. You know, I did this talk in LA last week, and I just, when I was going through my slides, I thought, you know, 78 million, that's a big number, and people can capture that. You know, they can realize that threat. But then I said, so how much data is that exactly, right? If it's just personal information that they lost, what would be in my record, right? How many bytes would it take to make up the minimalist view of my record if I was in that group, right? And so I took my name and my first and last name, my address, my spouse, my siblings, or not my siblings, my dependents, my children, and I added all the characters that it would take to represent me as a record and my family. And it was 1,349 characters. Well, there's 1 byte per character, right? So if you figure 1,349 bytes to represent my one record, and then you times that times 78.8 million records, then you'll come up with that big number of 106,301,200,000 bytes to represent that. Now, in LA, I had a guy that raised his hand and he said, you know, that's not that much. It's 106 gig. And I said, that's true. You know, 720p movie that you would download from Amazon.com is probably 5 gig. So in the grand scheme, I guess you could say that that's not a lot of data. But when you start thinking about it, if you're going to do a smash and grab on an organization and try to get all their data out of their database, and you're going to try to get 106 gigabytes out of their firewall without them knowing, that's pretty tough, or it should be, right? Wouldn't you agree? 106 gig is still 106 gig. So they don't usually do that. They don't usually do a smash and grab, right? They do a slow leak over time. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make with all these attacks. Usually the attackers have been there for a long time, and that's a problem. That's what we're trying to what we're trying to talk about here, about being more proactive instead of being reactive after the fact. All right, if you look at the standard maximum transmission unit of a normal packet on ISPs, that's about 1,500 bytes. So just more math for you, 69.6 million packets to represent the very smallest amount of data that would have had to take to get that much data out. Right, so we're talking about a lot of data. Perimeter, 11 million customers, same thing, social security numbers, banking info, but in this case they actually know, and they've done their investigation, and they know that this attack had 9 months before they realized it, right? 9 months. I've seen worse. We did a talk about advanced persistent threats. I think you guys have already had a talk about that already. So yeah, it's still a big problem, right? They get in and they go unknown for a long time. BTER, Chinese Bitcoin exchange, lost 1.7 million. You know, you had Advantage Dental, lost 152,000. This is just in this first part of the year already. And British Airways, they lost about tens of thousands of their most elite aircraft miles, right? The most elite traveler miles programs that they had. They lost tens of thousands of those accounts, right? And we just heard the special agent talking about Nigeria, how they're going after the miles now. Right? So it's not always about dollars, right? And even though British Airways didn't lose money, didn't have to pay for credit card monitoring and identity monitoring, right? They still had lots of loss of reputation because now they're not able to release the miles to their elite group of customers because they have no way of validating what changed, right? So you're taking your top tier customers and you're basically telling them, you got miles, but you can't use them until we figure this out. So can you imagine the reputational damage alone from that? All these attacks were malicious outsider attacks, not insider. We do have insider threats, but these were outsider, and they were a lifetime when you consider cyber time frames, right? So I like this visualization. This is a website called Information is Beautiful, and somebody just put the breach data in there to represent it. I like it because it shows visually kind of, you know, how big these attacks are in comparison with each other. And it's not 100% accurate. You can see latest, and Home Depot's kind of above that line, which is supposed to be 2015, but that's not necessarily true. Home Depot was more in 2014, whether it was at the end or not. You know, JP Morgan Chase, eBay was one of the big ones. So the bigger the circle, the worse the attack, or the more people affected. And then orange in this case just means that the author who built this data, he thought that there was an interesting story behind those particular attacks. So he labeled those as orange versus the others. But you can see on there, British Airways is at the top. There's Primera, right? We have obviously Anthem over there on the left, Target. All those were the big ones we've heard about. So just some quotes here that I wanted to point out. So the president and CEO of Jeff Rowe said from Primera, this is a lot of frustration. We understand that we have our privacy and security as our top priority. We're going to give you 2 years of free credit monitoring and identity theft protection services, including insurance. So that's not cheap, right? And then the big part that really got me is when he said, on January 29th, we discovered cyber attackers had got in, and later we found out that they had been there since May 5th of 2014. Lifetime, right? Same thing here. We already talked about British Airways, but at the bottom of their news announcement, they said the infection date was unknown. The interesting thing about this one as well is they say that we believe it was carried out by automated computer. So bots, right? Botnets, things like that. So. All right, so are you seeing a pattern yet, right? I hope you're seeing a pattern about the fact that a lot of these breaches had a long time frame, right? They didn't just, like I said before, smash and grab data and run out the front door, right? They've been there for a while. Right. Do you think that they're proactive in their network defense of these organizations or more reactive? Reactive, right? Yeah. Some of them didn't even know about it. So this comes from the Cisco report. In this case, I'm just showing you the top 10 industry victims according to Cisco. So why do you think the pharmaceutical and chemical is the top? Anyone want to guess? Intellectual property, good one. Anything else? Money, exactly. At least the perceived notion that those companies have money. Drug companies, oil companies, natural gas, obviously they're Mr. Moneybags, right? But some other things that were interesting as I've watched this over the year is food and beverage, right? I mean, that would have been so low before. And now we're starting to see it rise up. I mean, these are small organizations, restaurant chains and things like that. So I did some digging on that. I was like, why are they going after food and beverage? Basically, any point of sale system that's out there is fair game, right? They're going after anything and everything. And unfortunately, some of those point of sale systems are homegrown or local provided, so they don't have PCI compliance. They're not a big company that has to deal with that. So they're low-hanging fruit, and there's very fruitful for these hackers, right? Media and publishing, so Sony. You all know about Sony, right? So just an idea of what's going on by industry there. And then the ENSA report, that's the European Nation Information Security Association. They do a pretty good report as well, and they just did a wrap-up from 2014 data. So they say these are the top 10 threats. And you have to understand that even though the Trojan horse is kind of their top, that you may have used some of these underling levels, right? So spam may have been what initially got them on the box, which downloaded a Trojan, or maybe there was a web application that had some obfuscated JavaScript that was running malicious JavaScript to get some of these things happening. But the important thing I thought from their report was that we were, in their words, we were able to see impressive changes in the top threats, increased complexity of the attacks, but also successful internationally coordinated operations of law enforcement, right? So that's good, because in the past, this has been a big problem. We couldn't work together. The different agencies weren't able to get jurisdiction, things like that. So that's good. We were able to start shutting some of this down a little bit better across nation states. And then the last thing, but also successful attacks, which we hadn't really seen, on vital security components of the internet. Heartbleed, right? First time ever. We had all of our trust, all our chips on the table with SSL, and then it was vulnerable. And they got a lot of good business out of that. The hackers did. All right. Some other things that were really interesting about their report is that they were pointing out that malware defense tactics need to be revised. I agree. Defending against commodity malware consistently fails. In fact, 50% of the malware is undetected at this point by antivirus. Right, 30% of the malware used some kind of custom encryption. They didn't use SSL. You know why they didn't use SSL? Because there's overhead with SSL. There's a lot of handshakes, key exchanges, a lot of noise on the network. And so they found it inferior and came up with their own encryption. So it's even harder and faster and better than SSL, which is interesting in itself. Let me see if I can take this off. I like to walk around. So 30% used encryption. I'd say also the increased sophistication led to efficiency and evasion, definitely. And then we had malware kits that were doing, actually this isn't that new. Malware kits, at least some of the stuff that I saw even back in 2010, they were already doing stuff like this. They package up a product and they sell it on the black market. They say, you know, I've got an engine here, give me your malware, I'll run it through my code analyzer and I'll make sure it doesn't pop on any of the antiviruses out there. It's a packaged product, they actually sell it, right? Then they have even newer stuff that's called polymorphic, right? So when the malware runs, it changes every single time. You'll never get a static signature out of that piece of malware because the code itself jumbles up all the bytes, changes and pads, moves sections of the code around, changes the control path. It jumps through code, it goes through fake code. Sometimes the code's there, sometimes it's not. But it always does the same thing, right? If you start two completely separate samples of that malware side by side, it'll do the exact same thing. But if you ran it through an antivirus or you did an MD5 check of that, you'd get totally different results, right? So that's why antivirus is no longer that effective, at least static signature-wise, at dealing with this stuff. So I thought that was interesting. When you're going to go about analyzing your own network defense posture, let's talk about what that is, first of all, if you've never heard that before. Network defense posture is just a combination of your risk management, your IT governance, your information security, your network security, all tightly coupled together. That's your posture, right? So a good NDP would have performance and continuity of business operations. So if you were getting attacked, you would have some way to keep your e-commerce site up, right? And you'd have some fail-safes or some failover situations that you could deal with. User controls and monitoring, network health and monitoring, all of these things. These are kind of self-explanatory, right? Threat detections, threat prevention, whether that's insider or adversary. A lot of folks, they focus on the adversary, the outsider. They don't even think about the insider. And then the incident response capability. Now this one's really particularly interesting for me because on the consulting jobs that I've gone to, the first thing I do when I sit in front of the CISO is I say, do you have an incident response capability? And most of the time they say, yeah, we've got it. And they pull out this stack of paper out of their drawer and they dust it off. See, I got it right here. Okay, well that's great. How long has it been since you tested it? Tested it? Well, we haven't had to use it, so we really don't test it. And it's like, well, so how do you know that it works? Well, I mean, it's in case of emergency, right? It's like break the glass, and then we grab and run the paper, and it helps us document all this stuff. And I said, you know, how many of those network diagram structures that you have there, how many have changed since the last time you wrote that? And they were like shaking their head. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah. So it's not going to do you any good, right? So just like anybody else, a fire department is going to drill, right? Law enforcement is going to drill. Air Force is going to drill. Everybody drills the things that they're trying to do. And in this case, when you have an incident response capability, you should also do the same thing. You should test it every once in a while, make sure it stays up to date. All right, so that's a big part of having a good network defense posture that a lot of people don't think about. Okay? So the other thing you might ask is, you know, do you even have one? Do you have a network defense posture? Have you evaluated that? But more importantly, have you let everybody else, or not everybody else, but somebody else, evaluate its effectiveness, right? That's the big one. A lot of these companies that I go to, they have their blinders on. They've gotten so isolated in their own culture, their own departments, their own way of doing things, that they haven't even considered, you know, letting somebody else with a different set of eyes come in and look at it. It makes a big difference, right? Are your security policies aligned with that defense posture, right? Do they complement each other? And are you evaluating whether they're effective or not? What kind of security policies and technical devices do you have that implements some way of knowing and identifying intruders on your network? Right? And do you have an accurate profile of what your network users are supposed to look like versus an attacker that's impersonating one? So this whole keep them out approach is no longer viable, right? We can't be delusional to think that we can detect all of this stuff, But at least if you assume that you're already compromised, you have a different perspective on it, right? You start changing the way you look at your network security. It starts becoming more of a living, breathing, constantly changing perpetual event, just like the attacks that are coming at you, right? And that's the point. We have to be a lot more proactive instead of the set it, forget it, or just constantly just responding to things that look like could be a threat. So let's talk about some of the differences here. Reactive network defense posture, you're going to have security staff responding to events, just like the ones we talked about at the breaches, right? Either by noticing the data breach, noticing the compromise, or maybe during a PCI compliance or a HIPAA compliance where an auditor found something, or user violations that finally surfaced that you've had a problem with, right? Or worse, you go into your office in the break room and turn on CNN and you find out you're on the news, right? That's the worst kind of way of finding out and reacting to a breach. Law enforcement's the other one, right? You have the FBI calling you and says, hey, you know, we've done some correlation here. We're getting flooded with the help desk and people lost their identity and they all seem to be routing back to you, right? And even further worse, your customers call you and say, I know this data was leaked from you. You got a problem, right? So that's the worst. Oh, and I like my quote here. I try to make you guys laugh again. So someone called 911, the patient's already dead, right? That's the equivalent of being in reactive mode when it comes to network security. You know, that you're calling 911 for help, but it's already done. You've already lost data. You've already lost reputation. Again, break up the monotony, right? So do you think Rick Grimes is reactive or proactive? I'd say he's proactive, right? I mean, if a zombie jumps on his back, then he's probably reactive. But they're pretty good on that show. If you watch Walking Dead, they're pretty good at sniffing out danger, right? And I just throw that up there to kind of break up the monotony of the slides. But it's kind of true. I mean, if you're actually looking for things to happen, you know, you'll be better prepared for them too. We'll skip the exercise. Basically, you know, with a reactive model, you're going to have your blinders on. And so you have no depth perception. That's what that was about. And under reactive postures, you're going to have little to no internal audits that are being performed. You're going to be relying on your antivirus, your intrusion detection system, your firewalls. Your hosts are usually not monitored or audited for compliance, right? You're going to have unauthorized users. They're assumed to be doing the policies, following the policies, but no validation. And you have little to no global threat awareness. All right. Now, vice versa, in a proactive NDP, your security staff are in constant engagement under the assumption the adversary has already penetrated the network, right? And business data or loss is occurring. So in this case, the other quote, you know, one situation where actually paranoia pays off, right? Nobody likes to act in paranoia mode, but in this case, you have to, right? So another comedy slide here. Paranoia, the unmistakable feeling that everyone is out to get you, including Cookie Monster. Now let's do an exercise here. Are those circles moving? I don't know. Sir, do you think those circles are moving? He says no. Ma'am, do you think those circles are moving? I don't know. I don't know. It looks like they're moving. Sometimes it seems like they're moving. I don't know. Maybe we should ask somebody else. Maybe we should go out and see if we can find the special agent again, see if he can tell us, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that you can't trust that you know everything, right? In this case, this is not an animated graphic, I can assure you. This is a JPEG file. It's not an animated GIF. It's not an embedded video. It is truly just a visual effect, right? An optical illusion. You've probably seen it before, actually. And it's just your mind playing tricks on you, right? So that could be a good thing. You know, if you're constantly thinking, is this moving? Is that an attack? Is this precursor event going to lead to something else? Should I record that IP address, right? Hey, Joe, is these circles moving? It looks like they're moving, right? That's what we're trying to get across here. So under proactive postures, you're going to have some kind of, you know, just the opposite, right? You're going to have audits, you're going to have red teams, probably have an internal SOC, right? Some kind of external third-party evaluation as well. And this new concept of the black team, you may have heard of red teams and you may have heard of blue teams, but you might not have heard of black teams. And this is what the government is doing. So the black team are called hunters. The black team's job is to literally go out day after day and hunt hackers that they assume is already in the network, right? So they're going to look for them. They're going to try to find them. They're going to look for little tidbits or footprints, or they're going to evaluate different things. They're going to challenge different things, just like that slide. I don't know. It looks like it's moving. You know, is it moving? I don't know. Let's go check. Let's write a script that goes around and looks around and see if we got any rogue IPs that we're not supposed to be on our network, you know? Things like that. So that's the no proactive approach. And the government is definitely installing and putting a lot of money to get people to be able to be on the black team. Right? Frequent monitoring, assumptions made, the adversary is already there, and you have some kind of global threat awareness in your group where you're actually looking for information from other organizations like yourself. So implementing a proactive defense is basically 3 phases, and I'll blow through these because I don't want to bore you to death, but basically you've got to come up with some good security policies, some good standard operating procedures that support a proactive model, right? You're going to come up with acceptable profiles, and this is your policies, right? What's acceptable? Well, it depends, right? So what may be acceptable for the accounting department may not be a good fit for the IT group, right? The IT group should be able to run admin commands, right? Drop into a terminal, have access to certain things, right? Where the accounting group should never do those kinds of things, you know? They need access to a network share, right? So you want to be able to write policies that'll be able to define what that acceptable use is. And then some kind of endpoint monitoring, auditing system, endpoint host, assessment system as well. We'll talk about those a little bit more. In phase 2, you're going to be testing those things, right? You've implemented them in phase 1. Now we're going to be testing them, and that's an ongoing thing. You're going to also develop more profiles against the application and the network this time. So before we had profiles for the policies and the procedures. Now you're doing it again, and you're saying, okay, now I need a profile that's going to match this application. What is normal for this application? It's PeopleSoft. What's normal? Okay, well, it does an automatic update usually every second of the month. Right? That's normal. You want to document that. Same thing for the network. We can look at our flow data. We can say that, okay, yeah, at 8 o'clock in the morning, we go, woof. You know, tons of people at work, they're all checking their email, they're all browsing the latest news, and then at 5 o'clock, we see a sharp decline. You know? And then maybe at 11 o'clock, we see automatic updates go through. But you can profile those things, right? So that's what we're talking about here. And then you need some kind of data tagging capability for your critical data. Now, this one's especially close to home. I went to Germany twice now, and I sat in front of some CISOs over there. And their biggest concern, when we sat across the table from a one-on-one, I said, what keeps you up at night? And almost all of them said, I don't know where my data's going. And I'm worried that I'm losing it, right? I have no way of knowing. I had a guy from Vestas, the big wind turbine companies. He sat across from me, he said, my CAD drawings, if I lost them, and they found their way to Chinese hands where they can build them for a fraction of the cost, I'd be out of work tomorrow. And they're all over my network. People are exchanging them, they're emailing them, they're printing them, they're moving them from this share to that share. I have no idea where they go. But it's critical to my business that I know, and I have no way to know, right? So data tagging, I mean, it's kind of a fairly new concept, but there's ways to do that. You can do it through files and digital watermarking. You know, that's what we did in our R&D effort. And then you can track it, but you're going to have access to endpoints, right? You can't just track it on the network, because what if somebody puts it on a USB device and walks it over to this machine that has access to Gmail, right? So you've got to have endpoint. Endpoint is huge when you're trying to do proactive defense, so you can see where all this stuff is happening, not just on the network. Right? In phase 3, you're basically in maintenance mode, right? Just like anything else, you're going to still be maintaining continuous monitoring, logging, user monitoring, logging, and having some kind of proactive global threat intelligence meeting with your security staff to talk about the latest threats. Right. These are some of the details that go into some of these phases, and I think this is the important part, because we teach a lot of this in our class. Right? So I'll talk about the power of the precursor and some of the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that we can do. So precursors, I know that font's a little small, but precursors are so advantageous, but again, I go into some of these consultations and people don't even pay any attention to them. So example precursors, if you have specific, you know, lockdown area of your business that has critical data, you might not want to allow USB drives to be inserted, right? And I ask them, do you have any technology that monitors whether or not people are using USB drives? And they say, well, no, we turn it off in BIOS. We just kind of hope that people don't go around it. There's ways to be able to monitor that. And that's a precursor, because if people are inserting USB drives and they know it's against policy, that should raise your attention. You should move quickly to find out, right? Other better precursors, actions against policy. Right now, Silverlight, or I think it's Silverlight, what is it? Maybe I'm saying that wrong, but Internet Explorer has some big vulnerabilities in, I think it's Silverlight. Is that right? Does that sound right? Yeah. Yeah, it's the big one. And then so, you may have made the decision that we're going to only use Chrome in our office, and somebody fires up Internet Explorer, right? So that's kind of a precursor to something that could happen later, whether they did it accidentally or they're doing it on purpose, right? And these are some other big ones. VPN proxies. Right, I've talked to a lot of people that said, this malware got installed and it started doing a VPN proxy, so it bypassed my DNS, it did whatever it wanted, and it was doing it on an encrypted channel, so I couldn't even see it with my IDS. Well, they started just downloading all kinds of malware that may have been detectable, right? Because they were using a VPN right out of the network. So we can look for services like that. We can look for network traffic like that. Increased DNS. I've seen malware that runs, and as soon as it runs, it starts making what looks like DNS requests, right? Looking up host names. When in actuality, they're siphoning off data, right? It's an ingenious way to tunnel information out of these networks, because most of the time, you may have the best firewall in the world that doesn't allow only certain things. You may allow port 80 out, right, for web traffic. You may allow, certain things. But port 53, DNS is almost always open. It's one of those ports that you can't lock down. Even if you have your own internal DNS server that you want everybody to use, there's upstream DNS. So when they don't have records on the local presence, they're going to ask to provide, to get more information from an upstream DNS or a root server, right? So that's what they do. They start up a DNS. It looks like DNS. It goes out the firewall, no problem. And what they're doing is they're actually firing off information that's concealed in what looks like a DNS package. And I got an example of it. I'll show you how it looks in Network Tracker if we have time. So you might not want to allow downloading of executables, or you might have a certain person that can install software. Another precursor. You might have machine activity outside business hours. I'm surprised that nobody looks for this kind of stuff, right? Yeah, the machine's running at 2 o'clock in the morning. We see a huge network spike. Nobody noticed that. Why not? We should look for that. Right, deviation from normal human interaction. I love this one. All right, Joe from accounting, he comes in every day, 7:30, on time, every time, right? Gets his Keurig machine going, got his coffee. What does he do first? He opens up his email, right? Checks his email. Then he goes to CNN, checks the latest stats, ball game, whatever, right? And then he opens up his spreadsheet. You can model that, right? That's a pattern. Let's just face it, we're human beings. We're going to have ridiculous redundancy, even if you don't even want to. At a higher abstraction level, that just as a human being, you kind of do the same pattern, right? You do the same things. And we're not going to discriminate it so much to the nth degree that say, oh, well, Joe came in at 8 o'clock today, something's going on in the network. No. But there is ways to be able to say, okay, this is weird. Joe's not even supposed to be at work. It's 2 a.m. and he's running a SQL injection against my database. That's not normal Joe, right? So that's what I'm talking about. You got to have some kind of distinguishable profile for what your users are doing by their department or what they do or their skills that they have. And then you have the event correlation, which is also a big one too, right? So nobody does this. But you've got recon attacks where you have some IP address that's scanning you, or maybe a zombie network, a botnet that's scanning you. And we can't keep track of all that because you'd be busy all day looking at recon. Everybody scans everybody all the time, right? We have attackers constantly checking the doors and the locks of our organizations. But we might be able to correlate that with something that we see that got in, like an email address, right? And you can do this through automated means, so you're not taking up one person's time trying to track all that stuff down. And then that IP address is then seen leaving the network from one of your hosts. Now you've got some correlation that's going on, right? And that's valuable precursor information. So that's how you be more proactive. A large portion of the attacks currently implemented are happening at the host. They're not detectable on the network. There's a lot of companies out there that will sell you stuff that says that they'll be able to detect everything on the network, right? It's not true. You can't. It's one way to do it. And yeah, there is some great technologies out there that do a good job. But having an IDS and a perimeter firewall isn't enough anymore. So you've got to do the endpoints too. What good is your policy if you don't enforce it? Right? You say that you're not going to allow this, you're not going to allow that, but do you ever go around and check? Right? A lot of times, no. There's nothing that tells them at the endpoint. Nobody's installed any software, at least on the consultation gigs that I've done, nobody's gone to the point where they've gone to the endpoint and they've said, I want to know if Joe inserts a USB device. I want to know if somebody fires up Internet Explorer instead of Chrome. There's got to be validation of that. So a good endpoint security solution should be able to do that. Watch for policy violations and bubble them to the top, let somebody know. Right now, endpoint logging is huge too. I found some malware, found a machine, it's got malware, great, I got it, it's already done. Now what? How do you find out how it got there? When did it get here? Did my user do it, or did it happen as a result of a drive-by download? Is this insider threat or outsider threat? I don't know. How do you know? If you don't log some of this information, now granted, Windows has basic logging, right? You can go through some of the logs, but what if the malware dumps it? I've seen a lot of that. I've seen a lot of those privilege escalations that allow them to go in and dump all the records, or even selectively sponge out records out of the logs, so that even if you found your logs, it doesn't look like someone tampered with them, but there's no trace of them being on the machine. So you've got to have a way to do this at a lower level. All right? You've got to have ability to log events in a kind of a black hole way, right? It's transmit only. Some of the older versions of Snort, people would literally go to the network cable and they would cut the receive side. You'd have your transmit side. So data could go to the Snort box, but you'd never get anything back from the Snort box, right? That way, even if the attacker was launching attacks against it to try to take it out, right? They'd never get any kind of response for data back out of it. All right, it's kind of the same concept. You want to be able to log what's going on in your machine, but it should go into a black hole. It should be transmit only, right? And then they're maybe unaware of it too. If you have that kind of capability, then you have instant forensics, right? So if you can go back, even if you only hold the data for 30 days, you can go back and say, okay, at this point in time, that's when we had the notice that this happened. And so on my machines, I noticed there was a policy violation at that same time on these 10 machines. You start drilling into those 10 machines, and those machines have logging, right? So you say, okay, on this machine, here's my process list at the time. That's not right. You know, I have a standard baseline. I know what runs on these machines, and this is a foreign binary. Why is it running, right? Or the network traffic that was logged at this time also contains the same IP address that we see later in the day, you know, getting information out. Right, so that's so important, but yet so little people do it. The logging is so necessary. And that's also why you see in these breaches that says, you know, our initial investigation, and you know, months later they're still looking at it because they've paid Mandia $500 an hour to come in and try to reconstruct this data that's just not there. They don't log it, right? So it's difficult. Zero-day heuristics are huge. You know, so we listen to the special agent talk about zero-day and heuristics, right? Heuristics is the big thing right now. So it's important. Antivirus is half dead, right? 50% of the malware is getting through. So I'm not saying throw out your antivirus. Please don't do that. You still need it. But I'm just saying it's not a viable solution to depend on it completely, right? So we talked about polymorphic malware. We talked about how it changes and it rotates all the time. So instead, you have to come up with a way for common infection vectors instead. Like, so as an example, like you have a user that clicks an email link, and a connection is made to a foreign IP address, and then a DLL is dropped on the disk. Afterwards, we start seeing privileged admin commands. Now, this is Joe's machine. Joe doesn't know privileged admin commands, right? So again, that kind of ties into the profile. I don't have to know the exact bits and bytes of that particular piece of malware to be able to discover that, right? I can look at the patterns. I can look at the behavior, the heuristics, right? Same thing with like Internet Explorer. You know, it's getting better, but even on Windows 7, I was able to get Windows Microsoft Word to spawn a thread under a different process, right? Hide right in Internet Explorer. It's tricky stuff. It's getting harder, but now I've seen malware that says, okay, well, they don't let me just automatically spawn a thread under Internet Explorer anymore using my little macro. What they'll do now is they'll chain events together. They say, okay, I got a a 0-day here that gives me privilege escalation, and then allows me to do this and jump over here, and then I can spawn a thread under Internet Explorer because I'm running in the kernel space. Right? So it's still possible. Good endpoint security solution is going to correlate those events and let you know when something's fishy. The last thing here, global threat intelligence. You can't do it alone. I go so many times to these companies and I ask them, have you talked to other companies? You're in the banking industry, you're Bank of America. Have you gone over to Wachovia? Have you talked to PNC Bank? Do you guys share information when you get attacked or have vulnerabilities noticed that you didn't know about? You know? And they don't. Everybody keeps their blinders on. They, well, I don't know about them. They got their own problems. I got to deal with mine, right? But there's some good information there. There's CERT groups out there now. 10 years ago you wouldn't find this, but there's organizations that actually do this. Now they provide you with threat intelligence so we can all stay connected, right? We've implemented a service called Threat Shaman, and it's basically honeypots all over the world. And we take that data and we pull it out. We get the IP addresses. We look at the tools that they're using. We download their exploits. We download their vulnerabilities that they're going after and how they were doing it, and we get their tools while they're there. Not just to make static signatures. Again, that's not the right approach. But that information is still intelligence, right? And then when we see that same person over in a different honeypot, we know that they're going around, they're doing this thing as either an automated attack or whatever. And when I demonstrated that tool in Germany, we thought it was funny because we were actually trying to show people how it could automatically build intrusion detection signatures. And we were showing them the interactive map in real time where these attacks were happening on these honeypots. You could see them big, bright red. And the guy came up to me and goes, that's cool, but can I get the blacklisted IP addresses? That's all I really want. He wanted to put a blacklist of IPs of attackers, right? And that's valuable. I can see why you'd ask for that, right? But there's other things that we can do as well. Real quickly, I'll show you some of these tools that we built. So this is our threat perception tool, and it's basically got a lot of the things we talked about. In my case, we're looking at the cyber event timeline here. This is all about logging, right? So the hard part, and the reason why information security professionals haven't really adopted this yet or been willing to accept this, is because they don't want to take the performance off the machine, right? They don't want to bog down the users, right? So we approached it a little bit different way. And there's other products like this. So Greg Hoagland, if you know Greg Hoagland, that wrote Rootkit's book, he's got a product called Outlier. Does similar things, right? It's effective. Right? What we do is we got a blessing from Microsoft and a digital signature from Microsoft, and we run at the lowest level that we could get. It's called altitudes. When you get a digital certificate, a digitally signed driver, to run in kernel space with Microsoft, they assign you an altitude, and they have to go through your code, right? So antivirus is at like, whatever, 200,000 feet, right? And then you got people above that. You got people below that. Well, we were able to get at 60,000 feet in the altitude chart because we were able to claim that we're doing copy protection. Again, think Vestas, CAD drawings, right? This guy wants to know where his CAD drawings, copy protection. Right? So we were able to get that justified, and Microsoft offered us that. Now, so instead of just running the machine ragged, just constantly, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? That's not a good performance model. So what we do is every 10 minutes, we just kind of queue up this data. It's running at the kernel, so it's real small memory footprint, and it just only grabs the basic data, right? And then every 10 minutes, it just fires it off to a database. The database is doing the lifting, right? Because the database is doing the analytics. It's going through and going, okay, this is what the machine did. Last 10 minutes, here's the dump. All right, is there anything against policy? Is there a watermark violation? All right, so all the analytics are done on the backside, not on the host, the endpoint itself. So that allows you to do things like you see here. You have a timeline that you can look back through. All right, at this 1256, we had a policy violation where somebody inserted a USB device. They weren't supposed to have those. Right, that's a bad sign. And then we see a watermark violation. So we also allow people to digitally watermark their certain files. In this case, it was a DWG file, CAD drawing. All right, so that's also bad. And then data aggregation. So this is more the 0-day heuristic stuff, right? Again, it doesn't make sense for a normal machine to be able to go out and mine a bunch of data from the network People just don't do that. Unless you're doing like a backup or something like that, it's just not normal. They don't go out and just grab every network share and just start dumping data to their local disk, pulling it in, and pulling it in, and then dumping it out. Right? So data aggregation is another one of those telltale signs that we might have a problem. And it could be completely legitimate. Maybe that person is in charge of backing up the data today. Right? But you still got to know about it. And then the admin commands. So that's an example of a cyber event timeline that you can do and be more proactive. Same thing with the, the interface here is nice and whatever, but you've got network stuff as well that you've got to and it kind of ties the network traffic with the policy violation or the data aggregation as well. So you can kind of filter on that and pivot and see what happened. All right, if you want the slides, I'll leave this up for a while. That's the link. Feel free to download. And I'd like to open it up for questions at this point so we can have some more discussion without just me involved. Where's Dave? You don't have a microphone? Okay.
Your experience talking about data breach as opposed to an incident. Data breach, you have confirmation of exposure or exfiltration of data.
Right.
Either through a third party or staff, however you came to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the scenario. Who typically people who deal with owns the responsibility, and who should also?
Like responding to the breach?
Well, just the whole process, responding to the breach, coordinating forensics, public relations,
Right.
the press. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a pretty big, complex
It is.
set of things.
Yeah, it is, and it's difficult to say because, when you start talking that same question to the banking industry, they'll say, we're not going to share anything. This is, this is proprietary, right? We don't tell anybody, right? And then you go to an academia, a college, and they'll say, well, yeah, we're going to share everything, right? And then you have law enforcement that has a duty to do it, right? So of course they're going to call you when they know about it, but that could be a long time before they finally start putting the pieces together and saying all these users must belong to Target, right? Because all of them went to Target on this same day, right? But the responsibility, if you're asking me who it is, I say it's the organization that has the breach. And then the problem is, until recently, the CIOs, the CEOs, and the CISOs haven't had the ability to convince their board that there's a reason why they need to spend that kind of money. There's a reason why they need a SOC, right? A Security Operations Center. There's a reason why I need 3 guys that only do information security. I don't need another IT guy. I need a specific job field to do this kind of stuff. So I think the onus is on them. And they're finally starting to see it loud and clear, and because I've gone to so many conferences and everybody's talking about breach. There's no more talks about the polymorphic malware. And last year it was something else. This year it's all about breach, right? And being disaster preparedness and things like that. So did I answer your question?
Sort of. So the bank would say, we're not telling them who says that. CIO, CISO, General Counsel, CFO, who's the mouthpiece?
I don't know the answer to that. He's asking who has the responsibility of releasing that information that you've gotten attacked or the breach has occurred. Is that the CIO, or is that the general counsel, or who is that? And it's hard to say. There's no law, I can tell you that. There's no law that demands it. So there's still an issue of that. But I think it's getting better. I think people are realizing it only hurts them more to kind of keep it close hold and not tell people. Right? So you're seeing like these FAQ pages coming out after the breach. But at least in my experience, I've seen the restriction has come from general counsel. It's come from the legal team. And it's only because, well, no, I'll second that, actually. That's number 2. Number 1 is CEO, because they're afraid of stock value, right? Any kind of release of information that's going to devalue the stock, especially before they get out of the stock, is a big deal, right? Yeah. Any other questions? It's called MacoViz. And you can see it on my website there, anrc-services.com, and there's a products page. You can get access to it there. It's a free tool. You can upload binaries and then check it out. Yeah. Other questions? Got plenty of time. I ended early just for that reason. Machoviz. Yeah. M-A-C-H-O-V-I-Z. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Sure. Sure, I'll repeat for you guys. She's asking, how long does it usually take to develop a product that is going to identify these things? And I'll add to your question and to say that, and how quickly can you get it out before it's already obsolete? Right? That's a good question. It is difficult. And there's a lot of people that's still using old technologies and putting a spin on it and still selling it, unfortunately. But it all depends on, I would say it's getting better because small businesses are getting involved. So I'll tell you at least the government's point of view. Recently, they've completely said, okay, innovation, we're not giving that to the big boys. We're not going to give that to the Raytheons, the Boeings, Northrop Grumman. We're not even going to include them to the table. We're going to do what's called an innovative mission capabilities document. We're going to have a conference, and we're going to invite small businesses only. And the reason why is because small businesses are more rapid to produce that kind of technology, right? They give you 90 days to come up with a prototype. They say, here's our challenges. You got 90 days. Come up with a prototype. And every time the small business guys come to the table, they are able to produce. So while I can't definitively say exactly what that timeline is, I can tell you that they're getting better responses out of small businesses, and as we get more students and more cybersecurity professionals, that's getting easier because a lot of those people know programming and development. And unfortunately, you got to know so many different things. You got to be a jack of all trades. When I first started, I had some basic programming, but I didn't know malware. I started getting into malware, started self-teaching, going through it and figuring it out myself. And then that led me to vulnerability analysis, and that led me to, audits and data risk and compliance. And you just have to get all that stuff under your belt to be able to produce some of those tools, unfortunately. But did I answer it? Okay. Sir, in the back? You had a question? Right. Yeah. Yeah, I know, it's surprising. Yeah, you're right. And so my board came to me and said, we want to start doing managed security solutions. And we want you to do it. I was like, well, that's great. I mean, we've been trying to do that for years. We have all these guys that can do malware analysis, but yet PricewaterhouseCoopers, doesn't, or they do, but they're busy. They got too much. Bank of America has a whole group. They're busy. They can't do it all, right? So outsourcing is an option, right? As long as it's done right. But the CIO and the CISO is finally realizing, okay, it's my head if this comes to, the target, that was the first one. Everybody after that was, I started getting phone calls. And then Sony recently, I've literally had people call me and say, what do I got to do to not be the next Sony? because I'm responsible for this organization. I have no idea if my policies are being enforced. You know, I've got users that are clicking on stuff. Come and build me an education program, you know, and validate that my policies are being followed. And that's what our tool actually started as. Threat perception started as specifically, we just want to know if they're following the policy. Let's just run in the background and see if people are following the policy. And so the CISO can pull it up and say, you know, yes, my policy is being followed. Yes, sir.
You see companies start to integrate more security architecture and integrate with others. I see a lot of them got several things more disparate ideas can go here, color over here, all communicating together on policy and how all fits together.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so in the old days, people were saying, don't go with one vendor, right? Because if all your stuff is semantic, you know, what happens if this piece of malware has been built for, you know, to get by semantics? So you should have a checks and balances, right? You should also install Fortinet, or you should also install, you know, McAfee endpoint monitoring. Your antivirus is on the endpoints, or you know this, but your network is this, right? So you have the balance, and that's still a good idea. But what we've seen lately is that, at least in my world, my CEO came to me and said, I like threat perception, it's really good. But you're going to hear this, and we actually did hear this at different conferences. The people said, this is great, but I don't want another dashboard. You know, I don't need another dashboard. I don't need to look through another tool when I have snort violations all day long and false positives that I'm tracking down already on this dashboard. I don't need yours, right? So he came to me and said, you need to write a Splunk connector, right? Threat perception should be able to dump its data into any format so we can consolidate all of that and actually be useful for the system administrators and the IT security folks. And he's right, right? And I'm starting to see other people do that too. So you've got a good point. It's good to have, you know, we're definitely agnostic when it comes to vendors and security, and we don't provide any input in our classes as to who's better, Cisco versus Fortinet versus whatever. But you got to be agnostic, right? You can't put all your chips on the table, and you got to have something that's willing to work together, like a Splunk proxy that talks to your firewall, that does automated detection through snort or source fire or whatever, right? So it's a good point. Any other questions? I got a couple more minutes. I'd like to show you a couple slides. So I kind of give you an idea about DNS tunneling. This is one of the captures that I did of a piece of malware that we got from the wild. And I focused just on that, so it wouldn't be this obvious, so don't get the wrong idea. And maybe you don't even know what you're looking at here, but this is just a screenshot of Wireshark, which is a protocol analyzer to look at network traffic, right? And in our class, comes from our malicious network traffic analysis class, we talk about how you exfiltrate data. And we focus just on malicious network traffic. So here, you can see, it looks like a standard DNS query if you know what you're looking at. If you don't, just trust me. You've got one machine with an IP address on the left going to another machine. Now, understand it's simulated. It's on the same LAN. I downloaded the malware and I ran it caged in my own environment to see how it works. But that's a client talking to a server, DNS server on a different IP address. And it looks normal traffic, right? There's a CNAME request for a host called badguyserver.com. And the DNS server responds back, okay, yeah, here's the IP address for that particular server, right? Normal stuff. You keep going down and you'll start noticing where the exfiltration happens, right? If you go 3 up from the bottom, then you see our original client connecting back to that DNS service. And now look at the longer name that you got. Look at that garbage data in front of badguyserver.com. That's actually encrypted data that they tacked onto the front of the host, so it's still valid, it still meets the protocol rules of using DNS, right? But that data, that extra data, is actually, you know, exfiltration going on. And then the DNS server on the other side is like, okay, good, got that data, come on with another one, right? And so again, they'll use tactics like this to get out of the firewall because they know port 53 is open, that's what we're using. And if you're not watching for that kind of behavior, you might not see that kind of stuff. So a couple other slides here if you're interested. So I thought we were going to have a lot more students here, to be honest with you. But I push Python right now because, you know, your question was how quickly can you spin something up? The black teams don't build applications because they're gone, right? As soon as they put all their effort into building an entire application, compile it, you know, make it an executable, and then it's probably no good to them anymore. The attack's moved on. So what most people are doing now to stay fresh and fast is they're using scripting languages like Python. And you can do a lot of cool stuff with Python. I built a port scanner here that's in our Hacking with Python class. And it's multi-threaded, so you can do a lot of stuff. So a lot of the security engineers, they're using scripting to be able to do that kind of stuff. And this is a fuzzing application, so I won't bore you with the code, but there's things to do. And the other thing that's really cool about the scripting language, Python allows you to glue things together. So in this case, you're looking at a disassembler. It's ollie debug, right? And you can actually drive the disassembler, the debugger, with the Python code. So what does that allow you to do? Well, me by hand, I would have to go through that malware sample for maybe an hour or two, tracing through code. Where's my sections that I need to really focus on? But I can also have Python do it for me and look for specific things, right? So when we're talking about the new age of security, when you're talking about these black teams, these hacker hunters, you know, they're going to be writing scripts that automate a lot of this stuff. And Python's a good programming language to do that. There's others, Ruby on Rails, right? So I actually put that slide in there for any students that are here, because I get that question a lot. What programming language would you recommend to keep me up to speed with the latest and greatest stuff?
Okay, can we thank our speaker?
Thank you.